A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. We'll start the day with the story of the day. Today we will be talking about the story of Koir Bhuvastra. So the Kerala's water bodies during every monsoon, they go through this makeover, what is called as the Koir Bhuvastra. So here Bhuvastra means it is a cloth that these water bodies are going to wear during the season of monsoon. Because during monsoon, these banks get usually eroded, and therefore, to prevent all that, this eco-friendly clothing is provided to the rivers and the lakes in Kerala. So the idea behind this is that the coir is actually a geotextile. So you may even have a full-fledged question on what are geotextiles and what are their merits. So coir is a geotextile and it has a very good tensile strength. So these geotextiles can be used for covering the eroding landscapes so that they can be prevented from further erosion. So that is why it is called as the Koir Bhuvastra. And in fact, it was used in 2019 in many places in Kerala to cover the slopes. So it helps in slope stabilization also. Then even on the canal banks and river banks to help it prevent from further erosion also it is used. And as coir is actually a natural fiber, so natural earth cover, it retains the earth's moisture and it also protects the roots of the plant. So this can be used in many those questions which ask for some nature-based solutions to problems like the moisture conservation or some environmental degradation, erosion of the banks. In all such cases, you can use this as a nature-based remedy or an example for in such questions. So in this case, also the coir gets disintegrated in around 5 to 6 years, and it enriches the soil and promotes vegetation growth. So, and also the use of coir or this geotextile in this purpose is also giving a fillip to the coir industry of Kerala, which has seen slackening demand. So through this, it has secured the lives of more than 2 lakh families also who depend on coir making as a traditional job. So this way it helps in preventing the erosion of the landscapes, preventing the erosion of the river banks. It is a good example of geotextiles. It helps in slope stabilization and all, provides livelihood to people, and it's a very eco-friendly measure. So when you are discussing about any environmental related issues and nature-based solutions to them, you can use this as an example. Now we'll start with the topics of the day. We will start with the first topic of the day, which is India EU relations. So the recent news is that now a virtual summit was held between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the European Council President and the European Commission President. So now let's take a quick at the important takeaways from this virtual meet. The first thing is that India and EU have decided that they are going to have strategic cooperation until the year 2025. So this commitment they have shown in this virtual summit. The second is that the coronavirus pandemic has led to the response that has to be from various countries. So both India and EU have now agreed that for the coronavirus pandemic, they are going to cooperate at the United Nations Security Council. And the third thing that they have agreed on is the free trade agreement negotiations were happening between the two, which was stalled in the year 2013. So now the two sides have decided to take this up again and start negotiating on that. So for this, they have formed what is called as a high-level dialogue. So this is going to be between the Commerce Minister of India and the EU Trade Commissioner. So they will start the high-level dialogues and they will try to conclude or take forward the bilateral trade and the investment agreement. And at the bottom line is that both India and EU have some shared universal values. So these values are of democracy, pluralism, the respect for the international institutions, and also multilateralism. So these are those 4 pillars or those 4 points where India and EU share some, they have common values, they have shared values. So democracy, pluralism, respect for international institutions, and multilateralism. So now we will take a look at the economic relations between the two. So EU has been one of the largest foreign direct investors in India. So 22% of the total FDI inflows that India get, that is from the European Union itself. But however, if we take a look at the FDI inflows of EU into China, that amounts to nearly 175 billion euros. But if you consider the FDI for India in the year 2018, the FDI from EU was just 67 billion euros. So, this shows how, in spite of a good relation between India and EU, the economic dependence or the economic relations between EU and China is rather more stronger looking at the figures of the FDI. But now that the various countries across the world are very apprehensive about China and the origin of the coronavirus and the way it is showing its aggressive and muscular approach, so several countries have now decided to diversify their value chains and also reduce their economic dependence on China. So this has given India a golden opportunity at this time, that many of the European companies which have invested in China, they are trying now to move out of China and find an alternative investment location. So India can use this and capitalize on this opportunity. And the best way to do that is to restart the FTA negotiations, which we are now restarting through the high level dialogue. So this is the basic relations. Next is the environmental issue. As far as environmental issue is concerned, even in this case, the India and EU can cooperate with each other. So EU has this ambitious target that by 2050 it wants to become a carbon emission, it wants to attain carbon emission neutrality. So for this, even India can have a similar goal, and given that India has also has its own commitments with the Paris Agreement, and it is also moving towards green energy. So this environmental cooperation and achieving carbon emission neutrality by 2050 can be a common goal for India and EU, and on this front they can cooperate. Next sphere of cooperation is the strategic. So we have already discussed how the two can cooperate in the Indo-Pacific region to reduce the predominant presence of China in the region, or the growing dominance of China in the region, and the aggressive behavior of China in the Indo-Pacific region. So on this front also, India and EU can collaborate with each other. The second is the international order. Both EU and India have always been supporters of a rule-based international order. So they can cooperate with each other in establishing and strengthening further this rule-based international order. So which means both India and EU will collaborate with each other, and they will promote some reforms in the multilateral institutions like WHO, UN, and WTO. All of these reforms can also be promoted by India and EU together, because both of them believe in a rule-based international order. So these are the various areas where India and EU can collaborate and cooperate in the future. Now we go to the next topic, which is industries and the issues affecting them. So this is part of your GS1 syllabus, which talks about the factors relating to the location of the industries, the distribution of raw materials, and all that. So here we will be talking about the sericulture industry in India. So the recent issue is that the Silk Association of India, which is a body that comprises of the cocoon farmers, silk reelers, and weavers, they have come together and they have requested the union government that the union government should ban the import of raw silk from China. So now why has this been requested is because the cheap imports of raw silk from China is actually hurting the indigenous silk industry. So it is making the domestically produced silk less competitive with respect to the cheap imports from China. So in fact, nearly 2,200 to 2,500 tons of silk is imported from China every year. But the Indian domestic silk industry produces about nearly 25,000 tons of raw silk every year. So therefore, if you look at the quantity that is imported from China compared to the quantity that is produced in India, so within a couple of years, the domestic industries can scale up and can also meet this additional demand, even if the Chinese the import of raw silk from China is banned. So also because the mulberry silk originating from China was being dumped in India at very low prices, and that was outcompeting the Indian raw silk, Indian produced silk. the central government had imposed an anti-dumping duty. So this anti-dumping duty of $1.85 on every kilogram of Chinese silk was imported. So now the Silk Association of India is asking either continue with this anti-dumping duty, which is now supposed to end by December 2020. So either extend this for another 5 more years or ban the import of raw silk from China. So this it shows how the government policies and can impact the development of an industry. So earlier, the domestic industry was reeling under this pressure of low cost or cheap imports from China. So therefore, it was because of this import of raw silk. So government had the policy of liberal import of raw silk from China, and because of this, the domestic industry was getting hurt. So when the pressure mounted on the government to do something against this, then it levied the anti-dumping duty on the import of raw silk from China. So this policy of the government helped in the revival of domestic industry because very cheap imports of silk from China stopped coming. So this is how the government policies can have an impact on the industrial development in India. So this can be as an example. Next is we'll be talking about stereotyping. So this can be an important topic in GS4. So you can have a question like what is stereotyping and explain how it can have consequences on the negative consequences or unethical consequences on the society by taking 1 or 2 examples. So you can have a question like that. So there were 2 articles basically, one that was on the stereotyping that is done in the pandemic times and the other on the victims of sexual abuse. So we will take these 2 articles together and see what can be the effect of stereotyping. So first let's have a look at the recent instances where this has come forward. So when the vegetable vendors in the Coimbatore market in Chennai, so they have grabbed media attention because they had been termed as super spreaders. So this term has become very popular that some among the population have been termed as super spreaders. That is, they are going to spread the virus and the infection to far more number of people than generally a human being would do. So for instance, those people who had gathered at the Tablighi Jamaat religious congregation in Delhi, the vegetable vendors, fruit vendors, the garbage collectors, milk sellers, bus conductors, and the migrant workers who have returned back to their hometowns. So all of these categories of people have been termed as super spreaders, and therefore a stereotype has developed again on them. So similarly, if you look at the Ahmedabad there also the local newspaper, it ran a headline saying that beware of super spreaders, while it was reporting on the vegetable vendors and the kirana store owners, because there was a rise in the number of COVID cases in this category of people, that is the vegetable vendors and the kirana store owners. In Daman and Diu also, the local administration had banned the vegetable vendors who were entering the union territory from Gujarat. So the Daman and Diu administration has completely banned the entry of those vegetable vendors. So because of the perception or the stereotype that these vegetable vendors are the super spreaders. So these are the various examples or instances in the past where this stereotyping has manifested. So now take a look at the negative consequences that this can give rise to. One is the discrimination in the society. So this leads to more discrimination against this category of people. So this will lead to increase in the hostility among the population and development of a negative attitude against this section of the people. So this discrimination is something that is a result of stereotyping. The second one is aggression. So many times because of stereotyping, people also tend to get very aggressive in their approach. For example, after the Tablighi Jamaat incident, so there have been many instances where aggression was shown against people, particularly Muslims. So they were being harassed for their suspected affiliation or connection with the Tablighi Jamaat. So this aggression is also another behavior that is associated with stereotyping. That is another result of the development of such stereotypes. The third is the vulnerability. So if you look at the sections of people against whom we have such stereotypes in the society, these vegetable vendors, the milk sellers, bus conductors, etc., they are already that section of the society which is already very vulnerable. So they have to go out and they have to do their activities in order to make a living, in order to get some income. So by stereotyping them, their vulnerability further increases. So stereotyping further deepens and further worsens their vulnerability in the society. So this is a third consequence, negative consequence of stereotyping. So we will have a look at the second article on the rape stereotypes. So there is what is called as this genuine victims. So genuine victims or survivors of rape, they are those victims who are expected that they will not put themselves in some situations which might lead to rape. For example, genuine victims are those who do not go out for drinking or partying. In fact, in the Nirbhaya case, also the defense spoke about why the girl was out there in the night at such a lonely place. So, the consequences of all this is that, first of all, the reporting of such crimes, of sexual offences, is already low in India. And reporting is low, and the rates of conviction are also low. When such stereotypes are there in the society, then the reporting of cases will further reduce, and the survivors of rape will not have that courage to go to the police station and report the assault on them. The second consequences, it also has deep rooted the patriarchal bias that is already there in the society. So this also will further increase. And third is that it will be a blot on the criminal justice system, because even before the judgment, these stereotypes will shift the fault on the victim itself. So all of this will have a chilling effect for future survivors of rape also. So it will be a blot on the criminal justice system as well. So these are the consequences of having another type of stereotype, which is a rape stereotype. So now you can understand what a stereotype is, and you will be able to explain it, what consequences it has on the society, by giving two examples. This is about the parliamentary committees, and so you can have a question as part of your GS paper 2 about the working of the parliamentary committees, to analyze their working with the help of examples. So these parliamentary committees, the role that they play is they make the government more proactive, and they also hold the government accountable for its actions in the parliament. So we will take a quick look at an example of this. So recently, this parliamentary committee on home affairs. So this parliamentary committee on home affairs has first of all made the government proactive by saying that this whole COVID-19 pandemic had led to a lot of reverse migration of the migrant workers from the urban areas to the rural areas. So they have faced a lot of crisis in this situation. But the government does not even have an authentic database of the, or an exact number of the migrants in India. So therefore, it has recommended that the government should set up a national database of all the migrant workers in India, so that it becomes very easy whenever welfare measures are planned for them. So the targeting also will be more foolproof, and there will not be any problems of exclusion. So the panel has now, the Parliamentary Committee on Home Affairs has now recommended that there has to be a national database of all the migrant workers. So this has made the government more proactive. So government may take this suggestion and may set up this national database. The second is that it is these parliamentary committees also improve the accountability of the government to the parliament. So in this regard, this Committee on Home Affairs, it has asked the Home Secretary Ajay Bhalla and the other officials in the Home Ministry to explain that if there was better coordination among the states and the districts, and also between the center and the states, was it possible for was it possible that this massive exodus of the migrant workers that happened, and when they were not, it was not possible for them to go back to their homes, they started walking for hundreds of kilometers. All of this could have been avoided. So was it possible if there had been a better coordination between the states and the districts, this exodus and this crisis, migrant crisis, would have been avoided? So this is a question that this committee has asked to the Home Affairs Ministry. So this is thus making the government responsible and accountable to the steps that it has taken, and thus it will ensure further accountability. So this can be used as an example to show how the parliamentary committees will make the government more proactive and also accountable for its action. Next topic. So next is the issue related to hunger. So in this, the state of food security and nutrition in the world report has now come up. So according to this report, nearly 8.3 crore to 13 crore people in the whole world can go hungry because of the economic crisis that is triggered by the coronavirus pandemic. So according to this 2020 report of state of food security and nutrition in the, and as far as the status of Asia is concerned, the report says that the greatest number of the undernourished people are in Asia, which the figure has been put at 38 crores. And also it says that nearly 300 crore people globally, they are unable to take a balanced or rather a healthy diet in a day. So they cannot afford a healthy diet in a day. So that number is put at 300 crore. And it says that this 300 crore number is more than the combined population of China and India, which are the two most populous countries in the world. So it is these many number of people who cannot afford to have a healthy diet. So this you can use when in GS1 and then in GS2 when you're talking about the issues related to poverty and hunger. So this is a specific topic in the syllabus. So there you can use this data that is given by this report. So and this is very authentic data because this report is formed or is produced by the Food and Agriculture Organization, UNICEF, and World Food Program, even WHO. All of these together contribute to this making of this report. So this is a very authentic report which and its data can be used in your answers. So next is an issue related to the wildlife protection. So in this, the central government had planned a railway line between Akola in Maharashtra and Khandwa in Madhya Pradesh. So this railway line actually passes through the core area of the Melghat Tiger Reserve. So and the project that was planned to be undertaken in between this was the gauge conversion. So the Indian Railways was supposed to take up this project of gauge conversion on this line between Akola and Khandwa. So this railway line is passing through the Melghat Tiger Reserve, and not just in at any part of the Tiger Reserve, it is also passing through the core part of this Tiger Reserve. So therefore now Maharashtra government, the chief minister has written to the union government that if any alternative can be proposed to this railway line through the Melghat Tiger Reserve, because it passes through the core of the reserve and therefore it will threaten and endanger the already endangered species, that is the tigers. So tigers are already endangered and such a measure could further endanger the tigers. And also because while this project needs to be if this project has to be undertaken, it will lead to cutting of a number of tunnels through this, and also it involves blasting of rocks using heavy machinery and even explosives. So all of this can threaten the wildlife population in this tiger reserve, particularly the tigers. So therefore it has written to the union government for if any alternative can be proposed for this particular project. So you can quote this project and the fact that it is going through the core area of the Melghat Tiger Reserve whenever we are talking about wildlife protection issues. So this comes under your GS paper 3, environment related issues and wildlife protection issues. Next is a disinvestment. So disinvestment can come under your GS paper 3, economy and resource mobilization and all that. So under this you can expect this topic. So when we talk of disinvestment, it is giving up of the government's stake in its public sector enterprises. So that is a basic understanding of a disinvestment. So as far as a target is concerned, government had a target of mobilizing nearly 2.1 lakh crore from the sale of its stake in companies like Air India, in LIC, all of that. But however, government has kept such huge targets, but the past records show that the disinvestment targets have become very difficult to realize. So last year, in the previous financial year, that is, the original target that was kept for disinvestment was 1.05 lakh crore. But later on, it was felt that this is a very huge target, which it may not be possible to realize it. So the disinvestment target was further revised to 65,000 crore. But however, the actual proceeds at the end of the year, it came down only to nearly 50,000 crore. So this shows that the disinvestment proceeds have not been very encouraging, and the proceeds from disinvestment have remained almost stagnant at just 0.3% of the GDP over the last 5 years. So this one you can say that how disinvestment as a method of resource mobilization has not been in the past. So what should be our privatization program? So recently in the month of May, our finance minister Nirmala Sitharaman had announced a comprehensive package which also involved a comprehensive privatization program. So, under this, what the government is going to do is it's going to make a list of some strategic sectors where the presence of the government is very essential. So, then, even in these strategic sectors, it is going to open it to the private sector. So, the role of private sector, even in these strategic sectors, is going to be there. But, however, at least one enterprise would remain in the public sector. So that is the whole point of this program of privatization. So strategic sectors are going to be identified in which the government will definitely have its presence. So not that private sectors will not be allowed in this, they will be allowed, but at least one enterprise is going to be in the public sector itself. And the next it talks about this privatization program talks about the fact that apart from the strategic sectors there are several other PSUs. So then the government plans to go for privatization of the rest of the public sector enterprises. So this is the privatization program of the government. And then we'll have a look at the twin gains that the government can have from this disinvestment process. One is that it can mobilize revenue, and the second is that there will also be efficiency gain. So government, when it operates as a government or a public sector enterprise, there are a lot of boundaries, or there are a lot of regulations under which it operates. But a private sector has more freedom and more flexibility to operate, which can improve its efficiency. So there are the two gains that the government gets. Is one is that it can plug its revenue gap, so it is a means of revenue mobilization, and second, it can also help the government in efficiency gains. And also, if the government at all decides that it is not going to privatize something, then the government also has to pay a cost for not privatization. For example, look at the competitive sectors like aviation and telecom. So if you look at Air India and BSNL, both of them are loss making. So why? Because in both these sectors there are already a lot of competition that is coming from the private sectors. So if you look at aviation, more than 80% of the market is already the traffic. More than 80% of the traffic is already now borne by the private sector airlines. So same goes with the telecom sector also. So that is why there is a cost involved if the government decides not to privatize these institutions, these enterprises, because the private sector is already present in these, and the private sector is much more competitive. So therefore, it will be a loss if the government tries to keep hold of these enterprises without privatizing them. So, the way forward. The first mistake that we do, we just saw in the data that how we are unable to meet the estimates of the disinvestment proceeds. So, how we planned for more than 1 lakh crore of disinvestment proceeds, but we ended up just getting 50,000 crore of disinvestment proceeds. So, the first mistake we are doing in this regard is we are considering that disinvestment is a process or is just a means to plug our revenue gap. So it is always seen as a means of getting that additional amount of money or revenue to finance the government activities. So we must stop seeing this as only a measure to plug the revenue gap. So rather, we must come out with a medium-term roadmap. So this medium-term roadmap should list who are all the potential candidates who can be the disinvestment can be done in those entities, and also we should be clear about the what is the period of disinvestment and all that, so that there is more clarity for the investors also. So now many investors, they do not come forward when the disinvestments happen because there is a lack of clarity on the disinvestment policy of the government. So therefore this clarity has to be there, and that can be brought about by this medium term roadmap. So this is what we have to do in the future. So next is the police reforms. So police reforms, we have already seen a lot of articles, but I still kept this article. I have taken those points which are I felt many of the points in this article were unique, and also they were supported by some good facts. So that is why I have kept this article on police reforms. So let's quickly look at the issues which are involved and the corresponding solutions. The first is the community safety. So, what the issue here is that the police in India, in the colonial times, they were the police in the police state. So, they were just supposed to prevent crimes and all, just maintain law and order. But now, in a welfare state, the police are supposed to build bridges with the people, and policing had to be community centric or citizen centric. But that is still not happening. So, when this Black Lives Matter movement started in US, the Minneapolis Council has now drafted a plan which says that we have to abolish police, and that has to be replaced with a Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. So this shows how there has been a shift in the focus in United States. So what this law proposes to do. A similar shift is required in India also, where we need to focus more on community safety and violence prevention. So this shows a very good example of Minneapolis Council and its draft plan to completely abolish police and replace that with the Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention. So this is the issue, and the solution is we need to shift from crime prevention to community safety. That is the from being policed people from being policed to a citizen-centric policing. So this is the first transition that needs to be done. The second thing is a sensitization. So we saw yesterday that the training of the police has not been paid a lot of attention to, particularly in the modules like human rights, gender rights. In all of this, enough sensitization of the police personnel have not been done. So even the Bureau for Police Research and Development, the BPRD, which was set up in the year 1970, the purpose of this was to ensure modernization of the policing. But however, even this institution, it has rarely engaged with the human right issues. So therefore, the solution is we need to modernize our police, keeping in mind the requirement of sensitization. So there needs to be more attitudinal training, where the police have to be sensitized about the rights of the women, about the rights of the more vulnerable people, and about the human rights in general. So this is the part of the solution that we have. The next is related to the training. So training is if you police is a state subject. So if you look at the states, the training, particularly in service training for the lower level police officials and the constabulary, is almost nil. So only there is some amount of entry level training, but in service training is completely absent in these cases, particularly for constabulary. So we need to bring about this in-service training where their attitude is molded according to the changes in the societal and the crime sphere. So this in-service training is another thing that has to be looked into. Next is the facilities. The state or the status of policing in India report 2019. So you can quote this report, the status of policing in India report 2019. It points out that 70 police stations across 20 states, they do not even have wireless facilities, and nearly 214 police stations, they don't even have a telephone. So when the basic facilities is absent, then how can we expect that the police should perform very efficiently and should deal with the public or should deal with the crime very patiently? So this lack of basic facilities is another hurdle in the development or modernization of the police. Next is the technology. There has been the sophistication level in the crimes has also been on an increase. So which means the technological upgradation even among the police forces will have to be on a rise, so that the police can match up with the sophistication in the crimes in the society. But however, 40% of the police stations in the country, they cannot avail of the help of forensic technologies. So forensic technology is a must and is very important in the investigation process if we need good grounds for conviction. So this again is not accessible for 40% of the police stations in the country. So this is another reason for which has to be further improved upon, that forensic technology and such technological upgradation in the police forces is very important. So therefore, this article states that we need what is called as a national curriculum framework. Just like we have it for the engineering services, medical services, and teachers, even for police, we need to have what is called as a national curriculum framework. And this framework should include all the points which we covered in the previous slide. And only then the police will be able to stay true to their motto, with you, for you, always. So with this, we end the police. Next is we come to the challenges to diplomacy. So this comes under your GS2 international relations. So you can have a question like India's diplomatic relations with several countries is there, but however there are several challenges to the diplomacy that India undertakes with the rest of the world. So enumerate these challenges and give your solutions. So let's take a look at the two of these challenges. This content is spread over two editorials which I am combining. Let's come to the challenges that the Indian diplomacy is facing. First is related to the delays in the projects that India undertakes in its neighboring countries or any country for that matter as part of its diplomatic efforts to reach out to those countries. But there is innumerable number of delay that is involved in the completion of those projects. So consider, for example, Iran. So India was supposed to build a railway line from Chabahar to Zahedan, which could have provided us access to Afghanistan and from Afghanistan to further Central Asia by bypassing Pakistan. But however, there was a lot of delay involved in the construction of this railway line from Chabahar to Zahedan. And now Iran has said that it will itself construct this railway line from its own funds. So then if you next look at the Pancheshwar Dam project in Nepal. So this project was first proposed in the way back in 1991 itself. But then it was never completed. And then when Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Nepal in the year 2014, he promised that this project will be speeded up and it will be completed as soon as possible. But even now, little progress has been made on the Pancheshwar Dam project. So this again is an example of the delay involved. The third is a trilateral highway between India, Myanmar, and Thailand. We had proposed this trilateral highway, but then there was so much of delay involved that it was not built, and this was even overshadowed by the Chinese built highway between China and the Myanmar border. So that has led to improvement of trade in this region. But then our trilateral highway, the India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral highway was not completed. So this is a third example of the delay that is involved in various projects that we initiate in various countries. So this has posed a challenge to our diplomacy because these countries are worried about and they are disappointed with the performance of India over the contracts that it has signed. So this delay is not well taken in these countries. So even Nepal has time and again pointed out to the delays involved in the Pancheshwar Dam project. Iran is now coming close to China because of the again delays by India. So this is one challenge. The next is the strategic autonomy. So many of the times when we conduct our diplomacy, the strategic autonomy that we enjoy is not so much. So this is very clearly exemplified by the recent Iran-China cooperation that is going on. So there was a delay in the construction of Chabahar-Zahedan railway line because of the United States sanctions that were imposed on Iran. So India initially delayed this project because it feared that if any country was engaged with Iran, then US sanctions could be attracted on that country as well. So India was kind of fearful about the US sanctions being imposed on India, so it delayed this railway line project from Chabahar to Zahedan. So this lack of strategic autonomy at times is another challenge that the Indian diplomacy is facing. The third challenge is the decline of soft power. Soft power is like it's the power or the way of influencing the countries by the power of religion and culture. So we have used this soft power many times in order to establish diplomatic relations. So we have established what is called as a Sanskritic mandala. So through say by establishing common links with a religion, say Buddhism for instance. So this cultural circle has become very important for India. In that, the most prominent is a Buddhist circle, which has enabled us to have our influence in the region. We trace it back to Emperor Ashoka, and the influence included Sri Lanka, Burma, Nepal, Central Asia also. And this concept of soft power was first introduced by Joseph Nye way back in 1980s. So this means that soft power just denotes the ability of the nations to influence other nations without using any force. So this decline in the soft power is also now another challenge that the Indian diplomacy is facing. So India's soft power, which it has exerted through the links of Buddhism, through yoga, meditation, Ayurveda, and all that, it shows our exercise of soft power. So without that, and now there is a decline in the ability of soft power to influence the countries in the region. So therefore, this way, the decline in the soft power, this has posed a challenge to our diplomatic efforts also. You can have another question by saying that in the recent years there has been a decline in the soft power, so enumerate reasons for that. So this can be a separate question for you. So when you're talking about this decline in the soft power, the first thing you're going to say is you're going to talk about Joseph Knight, who coined this concept of soft power in the 1980s, and they are going to give a small definition of what soft power means, where the countries are able to influence the other countries without actually using any force. So this can be through religion, culture, traditional ties and civilizational ties, human rights, and whatever. So all that, so that with that you will give a basic introduction of the concept of soft power. Then the two arguments in support of this decline of soft power that is given in the editorial we will be discussing. The first is that the China's soft power has China has started to maliciously use its soft power. For example, there are these Confucius Institutes of China. So they have a very dominant position or presence in India's neighborhood. So one example of that is Mandarin has found its way even into the school curricula also. So this shows how much the Chinese soft power is increasing in the region. So one consequence of the increase in China's soft power is that it has correspondingly brought down the influence that the India's soft power could have exerted. So this has kind of become like a zero-sum game of the Chinese and India's soft power. So with the increase in Chinese soft power, there is a decline in India's soft power also in the region. The next point for decline in India's soft power is the oneness versus uniqueness. So whenever we talk about soft powers, we say that this is because of the common cultural and civilizational linkages between the countries which are unifying us. But then now countries do not want to be recognized through this concept of oneness or togetherness. Rather, they say that their culture is more unique. So this uniqueness is a favor of the is the flavor of the season in each country. So that is what it is said. So now countries do not want to be called that they are all together, they are one and united, but rather countries want to be recognized for their uniqueness. So that is why this soft power and the common cultural and civilizational values are losing their sense of appeal, and therefore there is a decline in the soft power. So in this regard, what way forward we should adopt is we must adopt for proactive diplomacy. At the same time, we must focus more attention on soft developmental needs of the neighboring countries, which can be connectivity, which can be education, health, it can be even finance. So these are the soft developmental needs which must be taken care of, and we should adopt a proactive diplomatic approach. So this should be a way forward. So that's it for today. Thank you.